You're listening to Margins and Meaning with John Wilson. Margins and Meaning accepts zero responsibility for remakes, delaminations, fractures, open contacts, poor scans, missing opposings, unindexed bytes, cases designed entirely by default settings on the virtual articulator that nobody has calibrated, or any prosthetic milled at 2 in the morning because the software said it was ready and you believed it. Anything I say on the show is just my opinion. It's not gospel. It's not CE. It's not legal advice, and it definitely may induce emotional damage. If you choose to listen to anything discussed here today, you do so at your own risk, preferably with a full night's sleep, sharp burrs, and a clinician who actually realizes there is, in fact, more shades in the shade guide than just A2. Also, if your virtual articulator is still running the factory condoler settings and you've never once wondered why, maybe sit down for this one. But remember, listen at your own risk. Thank you. Welcome back to Margins and Meaning. I'm John Wilson, and this is going to be episode 14. And I'm so glad that you're here. You know, last episode was heavy. I know that. Episode 13 was me sitting down and telling you exactly where I'm at. You know, that empty bench, the weight, the questions that got louder when the lab got just a bit quieter. And I shared that because I trust you and because I don't think honesty should have a season. And if I'm going to talk about the standards and the meaning on this show, well, I better be willing to show you the part where the meaning gets tested. So I appreciate you staying through that one, and I really mean that. But today, the craftsman's back at the bench. And I'm not pretending that episode 13 didn't happen, but maybe because of it, because the work continues. The work has always continued, and that's the whole point. You carry what you carry, and you show up, and you put your hands on the next case, and you do the thing that earned you the calluses in the first place. You know, I had a case on the bench the morning after I recorded episode 13. You know, it was a full arch case. You know, we had the digital scans, and the records just really needed my attention. And I sat down and looked at it, and there was this moment. Maybe it was just a second or two where the weight of the night before was still sitting on my chest. And then that case pulled me in, because that's what the work does. It doesn't care about your feelings. It needs your focus, and focus is its own kind of medicine. So today we're back to the format, one story, one principle, one tool. And this has been building on me for a while, guys, because it sits right at the center of something this trade is wrestling with every single day. The line between what the software knows and what the software doesn't feel. And yeah, I'm going to talk about teeth today and software and articulators most people have never ever even touched. But underneath all of that is something bigger. Something this trade doesn't discuss enough. The difference between what the machine can calculate and what only a human can feel. All right, guys, let's get into it. So let me take you back to a season of my career where I thought I was doing everything I was supposed to be doing, and somehow, some way I was still getting punished for it. Now, I was that younger tech, still building my name, still in that stretch where every new client felt like some sort of lifeline, and every case that went sideways felt like some sort of negative verdict. You know that feeling. You're really not established yet. You're not confident enough to push back. You may be good, but you certainly haven't earned the right to act like it. At least that's how I felt in my own head. You know, at that time, I was working with a lot of very high-end denture teeth. I was always looking for the next thing that was going to set me apart, give opportunity to upcharge. To be able to charge more for a more premium product was always a way to increase margins. So back in the day, I can remember a specific line of teeth that I loved. They were really a wonderfully versatile tooth, had a lot of stuff to it, but they were also very technique demanding. Now, when I share this, I'm not bashing any particular product. All products have, versatility in a lot of ways, and sometimes we are our own worst enemy. So sharing this story is not to degrade anything about the product. It's more or less to teach you a little bit about what I was going through and how it influenced my path in dentistry. So when the Phonares line of teeth came out, it was a different animal. It was a nanofilled hybrid composite tooth. That was a very fancy name. When you come from the hardened acrylic tooth lines of yesteryear, those IPN teeth, or any type of cross-linked style tooth that had some way to be able to call it more durable. Well, these were a different animal. Composite was always that thing that was going to last longer. At least that's how it was presented to us. So having something that was going to give me a way to make something look better, but also last longer was really attractive to me. And guys, if you know that tooth line, you know that outer surface is so hard. I mean, it was very hard. Grinding on it, it would dust just like composite. And that inner surface, the part that actually bonded to the denture base, was super important to maintain and not grind it too thin. So back in the day, utilizing that tooth, well, I felt it was great because it functions. It wears like a denture tooth actually should. But here's the thing, that system only really worked when that system stays intact. You see, when you're holding those teeth in your hand before it's bonded and when it's not processed, well, it's perfect. You can feel the quality. It just seemed like a better, denser tooth than anything else. The light seemed to refract differently off of that tooth. There was translucency in that incisal third that really made that tooth look alive. It definitely didn't feel like some sort of commodity product. It was an engineered system, and I really was attracted to it. But here's where the trouble started with those particular teeth, and this is where the real wisdom comes in. The cases would come in, we'd get these bites that would be mounted, and the vertical would look okay. We had some clients that were way better than others when it came to collecting records. Some guys would fox plane their rims and index them just perfectly, give me some sort of a face bow or a coist plate or something to be able to mount these cases up in a better predictable manner. And honestly, those were the cases we loved. We felt more comfortable setting those, but oftentimes we just didn't have the inner arch space for this particular line of teeth. So we did what most young technicians always do. We made it work. I took those bites as gospel. I have to tell you that. In the early years, I would not modify it. I wouldn't open or close an articulator for anything. But when the occlusion didn't line up and when the bite said one thing and the anatomy was steering me another way, well, we did what every denture technician does. We just ground. We just ground and ground and ground. And grinding on those particular teeth had issues. When you would grind those inner surface of the Phonares tooth, you were not just adjusting the tooth, you were actually compromising that adhesion layer. You were thinning that PMMA to the point where its bonding to the base was limited. And then we did what we always would do. We would make it even worse. We'd grind some diatorics in there, try to make something to lock the acrylic in. But, the truth is that composite just didn't etch. And if it doesn't etch, you're not going to get any type of chemical bond to that particular material. So over the years, what would happen, even though I knew the material science, I knew what was going on. I knew my specifics on my bonding protocols. I respected the product. I never thought I was smarter than the scientists that invented this stuff. But after grinding on teeth for years, it was the most common thing to do because you had no choice. And then week after week, we would get different clients and different patients, and the same quiet little frustration would come out. Something was off. It wasn't just the tooth. It was actually how we looked at the records coming in. because we would see these delaminations, we would see teeth chipping, we would see things coming cleanly out of the base like, we had a wax film or something in between it, but it wasn't. It was actually the properties of that material and how we altered that tooth to cause our own problems. So after knowing this and spending a couple $100s on a set of teeth for this stuff to try to upcharge it, well, it became a real game changer for us because it had to be something that the client would see value with. Just because we like the looks of it, well, if it doesn't last, it makes zero sense. And the frustration of all of this is what it does to damage your reputation when things start failing. So I started to look at the records a little bit more. Very often we would then have to give ourselves a little more vertical dimension. And back in those days, that seemed like, wow, that's a radical thing to do. Opening a bite on a doctor's work, how dare you? That's just something you just didn't do. But after looking at thousands of arches and looking at the landmarks and looking how the retromolar pads and the tuberosities would line up, looking at the ridge anatomy and coming up with a better visual in my mind's eye of where the teeth used to be, allowed me to make some better educated guesses. And any seasoned denture technician that has been working in this trade knows exactly what I'm talking about. And guys, I want to be honest, it was still a guess. It was an educated one, a better one, but still a guess, no doubt. Because without some sort of FACEBO, without some sort of verified centric, without a clinician who's invested the time in getting the vertical correct, well, we're always just interpolating that information, right? But the difference is if you're interpolating the information from an evidence base or from nothing. That's where the real root of it all is. So started making those smaller changes. I started testing boundaries, adjusting the VDO by a millimeter or two here or there when the landmarks told me that the record was wrong. And that's the real wisdom here. That's not something that you learn right away. And how do you teach that? It wasn't because I was some sort of genius. It was just because I was frustrated with the problems that I was having. So I started looking at things in maybe a slightly different way. And I'll tell you something that happened with that. My confidence started to change. My confidence found a way to make me feel like, hey, maybe I'm making a meaningful change here. When you open that box, when you look at the records, and when you immediately are not just assuming that bite is correct, when you hold those casts in a certain way, when you look at the face, you look at those landmarks, you let the case actually talk to you before you start talking to it. That was my shift from that reactive technician to maybe an active participant in my role in the fabrication of this product. And that's really where the harder conversation started for me because some clinician needed my guidance. Some needed me to honor their data just perfectly, not change anything because they were better. And some of the ones that kept sending those mush bites and those collapsed arches with no landmarks, no real communication, well, guys, they needed the phone call. Which brings me to maybe the filter of it all. So that story I just talked to you about really isn't about the teeth, right? It's about trust. It's about learning when to follow the data and maybe when to lead beyond it. That distinction doesn't come from a textbook. I say it comes from the reps. It comes from years of reading cases, reading your clinician, and reading the space between maybe what the record's telling you and what the mouth is actually doing. You see, not all records are equal. And, the truth is not all clinicians are equal. And I don't mean that as a negative or a slam or any type of disrespect. I mean it as an observable fact. The clinician that sends those really nice records, the Fox plane rims I was mentioning, with great indexing and solid vertical stops, with detailed instructions telling me exactly what they're seeing and what they want. Well, that clinician is always going to get a different response from me than the one who sends in, maybe a preliminary impression as your final, or a bite that's been, looks like it's been sitting in a hot car. You know, you learn to read the patterns, and over time you build this thing that I call the filter. It's not a formula, it's actually a feel. Let's talk about the three types of clients. Well, client A sends in those detailed records. The bite generally seats with authority. The opposing tells what the truth actually is. And when I set teeth to those records, well, most times those try-ins go just perfect. And I follow the data perfectly because that data actually has earned my trust. Now, client B, well, they're almost as good as client A. They're always going to have one soft variable to the data. Maybe the vertical seems slightly closed, or maybe the indexing is side shifted just a smidge. We proceed with those cases, but I keep my judgment active. I make small, transparent adjustments, but if the case goes sideways at try-in, well, I know why, and I can sometimes feel better about articulating it without blame. But here's the real growth, guys. There's a client C. Client C always sends those cases back. Consistently, the records are weak. The communication is minimal. And every single time something fails, the conversation always starts with the same line. What happened? Like the lab is the only variable in the system. But here's the real truth of it all. Client C is where most of my growth really happened. Because early on, my response to client C was to be quiet, just silence. I'd accommodate it. I'd compensate for it. I'd grind those premium teeth with hope. I wouldn't say anything because I was afraid. I was afraid of alienating that account, losing the client, or more importantly, afraid of being wrong. But then that silence over time moved to maybe small little adjustments. I'd make a change to the video without saying anything. And then hoping that try-in would actually validate the instinct that I had. And eventually nobody was asking questions about it. Then those small adjustments moved to bigger conversations, real ones. Doctor, here's what I'm seeing in the records. Here's where the landmarks are suggesting. I'd like to recommend we'd open the bite by a few millimeters. And let's see how that patient's going to respond to try-in. That was the framework. That's how I started. That's how I moved those conversations. But doing that, the real benefit for me was not just the work was getting better, but my judgment was. That judgment was that conversation starter. It was allowing me to ask that doctor, hey, doctor, I think we can get better outcomes if we open this bite. Can we schedule a record appointment? Those types of calls became easier for me. But I'm telling you guys, that progression didn't happen overnight. It was over many, many years because I had to learn to trust my own judgment. But then, more importantly, I had to get my clinicians to trust in me. And that only materialized through the reps, through being right often more than being wrong. And that phone call, well, I stopped feeling afraid of it. I really felt like it was a service that I was providing at that point by talking to them in this manner. Now in the analog world, well, when we decided to adjust the video, there was a very specific approach to reducing the risk with that. The safest method was to set the maxillary arch with a full complement of teeth and maybe the mandibular anteriors at that increased VDO. And then we'd make a posterior wax rim on the lower to take a new bite at that try-in stage. The clinician would verify it, and then when we would complete the lower setup for the next try-in. But often the clinician would request maybe two things to be done. And in the analog days, it was didn't make much sense. It was a lot of extra effort, a lot of extra expense. And while we were trying to save our clinicians a way to save an appointment without wasting an extra step. There was a happy medium between what you could and couldn't do to expense to honor that. So knowing when the risk was appropriate, when the clinician's skills and the patient's tolerance to this anatomical evidence was pointing me in a specific manner, well, that's when the judgment was my new protocol. And that kind only exists because you've been wrong enough times to feel the weight of becoming right. And here's what I'll tell you honestly, I didn't always get it right. There were cases where I trusted the record when I shouldn't. There are cases where I adjusted the vertical and the patient just couldn't tolerate it. There was cases where I made the phone call and the doctor pushed back and I folded because I wasn't sure enough in my own read. That's the filter being built. It's not clean. It's not linear. It's the accumulation of thousands of moments where you had to choose between following and maybe leading. And you lived with the consequences of those choices, right? And I want to just tell you something to the younger technicians hearing this because I can feel you tensing up. You're thinking, I just can't call a doctor and tell them their bite's wrong. I'll lose the account. And I totally get it. I lived that. I was you. But here's what I wish somebody had told me when I was grinding on those expensive teeth. Now, the account you lose for being honest is cheaper than the reputation you lose by being silent. Every single time, guys. The math always works out on that way. It just doesn't feel like it in the moment. And guys, that's the filter. That's the judgment. And that's what I brought back to me when I moved into the digital world. So everything I just described, the grinding, those callbacks, the video decisions, the trust filter, all of that happened when I was sitting at the bench, holding mounted casts on adjustable articulators with my hands, with wax under my fingers and a torch in the other hand. Well, that world is still real for some people in this trade, a big section of this trade. And I certainly respect that. But my world moved. My world went digital. And I went in with it because digital didn't threaten my judgment I built. It actually just gave me a new tool to actually apply it. But here's what's changed and what's really important. The gut feeling is different when you're looking at the screen versus holding mounted casts. And I need to explain what I mean by that because it's not nostalgia. It's neurology. When I held a mounted cast in my hand on an articulator, I could feel that case. Literally, I could feel that hinge move. I could feel where the contacts were heavy. I could feel when the lateral excursions drug. I could rotate that cast in my hand in a different manner than I can on a screen. And in my hands, my shoulders, my spatial awareness, that just comes from holding a physical object over and over and over. But on a screen, you see it. You don't feel it. And that sounds like a small difference, but it's not. And I remember the first time I've designed a full arch case entirely in CAD without ever holding a cast. It was a good case, clean scans, everything looked right on the monitor, but I had this nagging feeling in my gut that I really couldn't figure out. And it took me a while to really name it. You see, I missed the weight. I missed that physical feedback of closing the articulator and feeling where the contacts actually loaded. I missed rotating the cast and watching how the light fell across the occlusal surfaces from, different angles. That screen gave me the data, but holding that articulator had given me experience. So now I've adapted. You have to. And I've gotten comfortable with the digital read, but it took me time. It took intention to it. And that's the part that really concerns me. Because a technician who starts in digital never has that analog reference. They don't know what they're missing because they've never had it. Now, the virtual articulator and dental CAD softwares are ridiculously powerful. They're amazing tools. They give you the ability to change values, that condylar inclination, the Bennett angle, the arc of closure, all of these terms that we know can be dialed in to a specific patient data if you have it. You can simulate that movement. You can adjust the opening. You can watch how maybe the design library you chose will interact with it. But here's the reality, guys. The vast majority of technicians working in digital today have no idea what those numbers mean. Not because they're lazy, not because they don't care, because they've never adjusted a real articulator. They've never held a dinar in their hands, or a Hannah, or a Sam, or whatever fancy snake biting style appliance that you ever had. And with that, not knowing what 30 degrees of condylar inclination versus 20 actually means. Hell, some of them never even seen one outside of a real photo. And I don't blame them. Those things look weird, man. I'm telling you, they could be a medieval torture device in a lot of ways. But, the funny thing about it, never having watched the working side and the balancing side do their dance on a semi-adjustable articulator on a setup, well, they've never learned what those numbers in the software actually represent in the physical world. So what do? What do most people do? They leave them at the default. That 30-degree condylar inclination, 15-degree Bennett angle, and for most cases, especially those shallow cuspal fossa morphology that most of these denture libraries have today, well, it works. The defaults work fine. The software generates acceptable contacts, and, if you're milling or printing it, the prosthetics will actually function. And the patient is comfortable and nobody complains, and it's great. Digital is great. But guys, that's not where the problem is. The problem is in the case that maybe isn't average. That severe class 2 with a deep overbite and retruded mandible, or that class 3 where the jaws are just really difficult to put the anterior posterior teeth in relation. The collapsed bites on those patients wearing the same set of dentures for 15 years and the clinic sends them in as the guide. Those worn, flattened teeth with a vertical dimension that you are absolutely certain are collapsed. Those cases expose the default. And today, with fewer preliminaries in many of the workflows, well, technicians are using, most of the times an older prosthetic as our scanning appliance to get our information. The clinic uses those data as it's going to be easy for Mrs. Smith to accept. But the problem is we have a collapsed bite now. The relationship is wrong. The patient needs to have an adaptation to be able to change and improve from where they are. But the clinic often doesn't alter that. They send what they have. And then it becomes my job, our job, to see it, to recognize that the guide they sent in is a deterioration of the roadmap for that restoration. To adjust that virtual articulator just like we did in the real days of analog. To move forward with the training that goes beyond what the screen is just telling me what to do. That's the translation. The same judgment I built at the bench when wax and plaster and the manual articulator was the norm. Well, I now apply that to the software that most people treat as automatic. I'll give you a real example. I had a case come through last year, full arch, upper and lower. The scan included the patient's existing denture for reference. That denture was, maybe 10, 12 years old. The cusps were flat. The vertical was completely collapsed. And, we needed to crank this thing open. But here's the real wisdom of it all. If I had accepted that scan data as the average value and designed the virtual articulator, the default setting, it would produce a prosthetic that replicated the problem, that looked beautiful on the screen, but functionally wrong in the mouth. So what do? We crank them open. I opened that virtual articulator, adjusted the inclination. I modified it all. So I designed that posterior morphology with, more cusp height and more reference because I knew what that old denture was telling me. I called the clinician. I walked him through what was done and why. Yeah, the case obviously inserted clean. The function was improved. The patient could chew the food that she was struggling with. And, that was great, right? And none of that came from the software. All of that came from the technician sitting behind it. And here's the part that worries me most. The speed of digital is actually the enemy of judgment. Click to finish. Move to the next case. The software proposes what to do. It suggests where the cusps are supposed to be. It calculates this based on average values. And guys, it looks beautiful on the screen. And it passes that eye test in 2 dimensions. But averages, they don't account for the patient in the chair. The human head is the best articulator in the world. It's the only system that knows exactly where that mandible wants to go to, how the muscles are going to fire, where the wear patterns actually live, what that TMJ will actually tolerate. And when we've replaced the attempt to understand that system with default settings and specific design libraries, well, what happens? Guys, I'm not against these tools. Let me be very clear. I use them every day. They're part of how I produce at the level that I produce. Digital and reductive manufacturing have actually expanded the possibilities in ways that still astonish me after all of these years. But I use them with something that the software just doesn't give you. Judgment. And that judgment, knowing when to trust the defaults and when to override them, knowing when the screen is lying to me and when it's telling me the truth. Well, that came from those analog years. It came from sitting at the bench. It came from thousands of arches I've held in my hands before a single one ever lived on the monitor screen. Which is why this episode matters, because the question isn't whether digital is better. It is in many ways. The question is whether we're producing technicians who can handle the case where digital alone isn't enough. And the tool I'm about to give you is one way that I actually handle that gap today. So what's this tool that I'm alluding to? Well, let me tell you. I call it the digital dual path try-in. I'm certain I'm not the only person that utilizes a workflow such as this, but let me share it with you. Because today in the digital workflow, we're milling or printing our try-ins, and that gives us the ability to do something that certainly wasn't practical back in the analog world. We can produce 2 mandibular appliances when we see the need to actually question the records. One at the acquired dimension, what the records are actually saying, what the clinic sent in, what the data is actually telling us. And then maybe one at the suggested dimension, one at what our judgment is telling us, one at what the landmarks actually indicate, what decades of reading anatomy and watching the patterns has taught us the vertical maybe should be doing. And both go back for try-in. Same patient, same appointment, 2 options. Now, this does 2 things, and both of them I think really matter. First, it shows that clinician that the lab values their time. We're not just sending the case back with a note that says, redo your records. We're not holding the case in the lab until we get what we need. We're actually owning our part. We're saying, hey, you know what? We see something here. We're invested in giving you options. Here's the data path. Here's the judgment path. You get to decide. And that's certainly much different than the phone call that just says, hey, you're wrong. This is the phone call that maybe says, hey, you know what, doc? We're partners here, and partners bring solutions. Second, I think it aims to save an appointment, because if we're right, if the lab is right, if that adjusted VDO is actually what that patient actually needed, well, you just eliminated a reset cycle, right? It surely is much, much better than discovering this problem at the try-in stage and having to send it back and having to do another redo setup and shipping it again, scheduling another appointment. Well, you've collapsed all of that into one visit. They tried in and They are able to figure it out, which one's better. And that's the answer itself that's revealed right there in the chair that day. So then the 3 to 4 appointment stays maybe 2 to 3. Instead of becoming that 6 to 7 that sometimes happened back in the analog days where you lost all your value in shipping that case back and forth. But here's the thing, guys. Let's talk about the decision framework and when it's prudent to actually implement this path. When are you going to deploy it? That's the only real thing that you need to know. Well, there's many signals that trigger this dual path. If today they're using an existing old worn flattened occlusion style denture as the scan appliance, well, you have to understand a couple things about what they're doing. If they're taking a reline inside of that prosthetic, and even though those teeth are flat, you have to be very certain that that reline hasn't cranked them open already. Secondly, if they're flat and worn and they're just scanning the appliance because they're going to take a wash impression inside the actual try-in, well, that's going to be influencing things as well. The reline material on the inside of all of the try-ins can and does increase the vertical dimension. Be wary of that. But here's the greatest thing. When you can signal those, when you can figure this and see that and understand this aspect, well, you're going to produce both paths. And this is how I made the phone calls, how I got started on this path to be able to talk to them in this manner. Doctor, I reviewed this case. The records are solid. I set the teeth up to the bite as received, but I'm telling you, I see something that may be indicating that we could increase the vertical dimension here a bit. Rather than just holding the case, I produced 2 mandibular setups. I'm not charging you for the second one. I'm trying to value our times together. I'm going to send you both back at the suggestion mark and at your acquired records. We'll be able to evaluate what we see chairside without losing that appointment. And doctor, here's really what I'm seeing. And then you explain it. Just a simple thing on what the landmarks are actually telling you, what your experience is telling you, what the risk is if you acquired the VDO that was too collapsed. You're not telling the doctor what to do. You're giving the doctor what they need to make the best decision in the chair with the patient in front of them. Guys, that's partnership. That's ownership. And that's the standard applied to a real clinical situation. Now, guys, I want to acknowledge something. Today's monolithic materials have changed a big part of that equation. In the old world where the material was actually going to be compromised if you reduce too much, today we can get incredible strengths in smaller dimensions. But here's the thing, guys. Achieving the durability without making a sacrifice is also going to cause problems down the line. The part that excites me the most is not just digital or analog. Digital and analog are tools. What's really exciting to me is how technology is actually handling the execution today. The technician handles the judgment, but when we utilize both, both what the technology can handle, but what the judgment is telling us, well, then we're working together. Because when the person behind the software brings the same depth and understanding that the person behind the articulator brought, well, the outcomes are extraordinary. The dual path try-in is a tool built on that combination. It uses digital efficiency to express that analog wisdom. It's fast because it's printed. It's economical because it's a small amount of resin. But it's smart because the technician with decades of pattern recognition said something about this case because this case needed to have something said. That's the instinct. That's the tool. The 2 try-ins are just the delivery mechanism of that wisdom. So here's the principle for today's episode, and I want to earn it before I just say it straight away. Everything I told you today, those Phonares teeth that shouldn't have been ground on, the filter that I built over many, many years of reading cases and reading the clinicians, that virtual articulator that most people never calibrate, that dual path try-in I just explained. Well, it all points to the same thing. The wisdom that makes a case succeed doesn't really live on the screen. It lives in thousands of arches that you've held, the patterns that you've seen, the failures you refused to ignore, the phone calls you finally made, the callbacks that taught you what the textbook couldn't, the compromises that haunted you until you stopped making them. Digital made that execution faster, but it didn't build the instinct. The instinct still comes from somewhere, right? And this is the central tension of the show. Guys, it's been here since episode 1. Technology answers how. Wisdom preserves the why. The how has never been more powerful, guys, but the why has never been more at risk. The real test isn't the routine case. The routine cases, the defaults actually work. The design library maybe is appropriate. The virtual articulator at the factory settings does do its job. The morphology looks right. The patient is happy. And you move on. But the real test, guys, is the anomaly. Those class 2, class 3, the collapsed bite, the compromised records, the patient has been wearing the same denture forever. That's where the technician either leads or follows. And following the script on a case that needs leadership is how mouths get punished for our timidity. I said it a long time ago, and I'll say it again. Your outcome follows intention, and intention follows understanding. And if the understanding only lives in the software, if the only reason you designed the occlusion this way is because the library told you to, and if the only reason you accepted the VDO as the record was because it said so, and the only reason you didn't call because calling felt uncomfortable, well, then the intention is borrowed. It's not yours. It's the software's best guess, and you've signed off on it. Guys, that's not craftsmanship. That's data entry with a dental license. Now, I'm not saying every technician needs 40 years of analogs experience to be effective in digital. That would be dishonest. That would be gatekeeping. And I told you from the beginning that's not what this show is. But what I am saying is that somewhere in a technician's journey, the judgment has to be built. And the judgment isn't built by clicking through a design proposal. It's built by understanding what the design is trying to accomplish in the biological system it's entering. It's built by studying anatomy, studying occlusion, studying the materials, studying failure. It's built by asking why something worked, not just if it worked. Judgment doesn't live like it's in a workflow. It lives in the person running it. And if we don't protect that distinction, well, we're producing a generation of technicians who can operate the software beautifully and have no idea what to do when the software is wrong. I've been thinking about something for a while now, and I think I should say it, and I hope it certainly lands where it should. The hardest part of what we do in this trade, I don't think is the work itself. I think it's passing the why behind the work to the next person. I think that's why, a technician with 30 years experience is going to see the case in a different manner than the tech with 3. And it's not because the younger tech isn't talented. I think it's because the older tech has watched more things fail. They've absorbed more consequences. They've actually carry this pattern in their body now. And guys, how do you teach that? Honestly, I don't fully know. I'm still trying to figure it out. I started this podcast as one attempt. The conversations I have with my team are another. The phone calls where I walk a clinician through my reasoning instead of just sending the case back with a note. That's another. But I know this. It's not a left to right playbook. You can't easily write the why into a step-by-step workflow. It doesn't fit in any design library, and it's certainly not going to be found in the settings menu. I think it lives in the space between what the software shows you and what the case actually needs. I think about young technicians coming up in this trade right now. I can't tell you how smart they are. They're super capable. Many of them are better with the software than I'll ever be. And that's not a threat. That's the future, and I welcome it. But guys, the software is only as good as the person directing it. And the person directing it needs to understand what they're directing and why. Not just which button to click, not which library to select, but why this morphology works for this patient. Why this vertical for this anatomy? Why this material for this function? That's the why. And it needs more conversations, more honesty, more willingness to stand in front of a room or on a microphone and say, here's what I got wrong. Here's what it cost. But most importantly, here's what it taught me. A patient trusts us enough to let us in their mouth. And the end of that chain, there's a technician whose name nobody knows, holding a prosthetic that has to function for years in conditions nobody can fully predict. Guys, I think that's worth protecting. That's worth talking about. That's worth more conversation than we're giving it. And if you're in your own little furnace right now, if you're the one grinding on those teeth, absorbing the callbacks, afraid to make the phone calls, wondering whether you're good enough, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. You're not a fraud. You're just not finished yet. The judgment will come. The filter will build. But guys, it's only going to happen if you stay curious. And please, refuse to let the software do the thinking for you. Keep asking why, even when the workflow doesn't require it. So here we are, back at the bench. Story's still coming. The format is still doing what I built it to do. One story, one principle, one tool, every single episode. And I've got a few things that I owe you. I promised you back in episode 9 and 10 that we would be getting into the phone call framework that I've mentioned. How you can put the real structure together for saying the real hard things without burning a relationship. And that's coming because I really believe the phone is still the most important instrument in the lab, and why most people actually fear it or avoid it in this trade, I don't understand. So we're going to bring that back, but more importantly, we're going to start talking about materials and talking about materials in a way that is different. I like to say, let's talk about them as a risk profile, not a menu that you choose from, because material choice isn't about just preference. It's about understanding what the system can tolerate and what happens when you actually exceed it. And eventually, and I mean this, I want to bring other people into this conversation, people who have earned their own wisdom, people who sat in their own furnace and came out with something real to share. Not to perform, not to promote, to be honest in the same room. And I'm looking forward to that. But today, here's what I want you to leave with. The software we have today is extraordinary. Use it, master it. Let it make you faster, more precise, and more capable than any generation of technician before you. But guys, please do not confuse the tool with the tradesman. The tool doesn't know why the bite is wrong. You do. The tool doesn't feel the callback coming. You do. The tool doesn't care about the patient. You do. That's what the software doesn't feel, guys, and it never will. Thank you for listening to episode 14 of Margins and Meaning. And guys, if this show has value to you, share it with one technician or one clinician who still cares about doing things the right way. This has been John Wilson for Margins and Meaning. And remember, protect your margins, protect your meaning. Thank you.